Thank you so much. The title of our panel this afternoon is "Where Do We Go From Here?" And I find that to be a very difficult but interesting topic. I am told that we had over 1,200 people register for this conference, which says to me that people are still very interested in our country and what happened in 1963, and certainly care enough to come to this conference and participate. I find many of the issues that have been raised to be extremely troubling. I think troubling on a profound level in consideration of our citizenship, in consideration of our relationship to our government. And that is my opinion, but I think from the discussion I've heard that others may share those concerns as well. I think this conference in many ways is a quintessentially American enterprise. I would remind you that Benjamin Franklin, a Pennsylvanian, came out of the constitutional discussions and he said to his countrymen, "It's a republic if you can keep it." And others of the founding generation had a serious concern about the maintenance of free democratic government in our country because of the pressures that come upon it, and the lessons of history which they had studied show that in fact a free society is very difficult to maintain against pressures. And there are many examples in the statements of the founders of concern about subsequent generations and the events that would occur in those generations. I feel, based on much of the information we've heard, that in fact the Kennedy assassination is one of those very troubling events, and it's still troubling to Americans today. So the Wecht Institute has attempted, in I think a very commendable way, to put together expert panels and people who are very knowledgeable so that we can begin to address some of these concerns. I would remind you that chiseled in the National Archives is the phrase, "What is past is prologue," and it is for that reason alone that studying the events of 40 years ago actually has current meaning and may have important meaning to us as a nation in the future. That said, I'd like to turn to our panel, and I believe my feeling in listening to a lot of the information presented at this conference is a very strong feeling that I get of an injustice that has occurred in our nation. In very simple terms, something wrong has happened that has affected the nation and has affected individual human beings in terms of the Kennedy family. And so I'd like to open by turning to our panel, and I would like to throw out the question and the concern first to Judge Tunheim, who has conducted activity on behalf of the United States government to attempt to bring out the information base to us. So he is a representative from the U.S. government who has done great service and work in the direction of what we would like to have done, and is currently sitting, as we know, as a federal judge. And I would say to him, I know he will want to inform us on other efforts that can be made to find documents that haven't been released, but I would also like to address the bigger question that I think is raised by this conference of where do we as Americans go, what can we do, where do we go to attempt to address a perceived injustice or a perceived wrong in this situation. Do you have any comments? I know it's a hard question and I'm sorry to toss one, but it's what occurs to me after listening to the events.
Well, I think you certainly, the review board statute remains, so agencies are still required to assemble any assassination records, still using our guidelines, the review board's guidelines, and using the review board's definition. And if they find them, they're supposed to turn them over right away to the National Archives for processing. And I think arguably they may not even have authority to redact because only the board had the authority to order redactions. But I suspect the agencies would not take that viewpoint. The problem is there's really no one there right now to oversee this process. The board recommended a follow-up independent advisory group to try to oversee this, to be able to go to Congress to tell them if there were problems, or to go to an agency head to look for relief. And that was not done. Nothing really has been done. There is a very good staff at the National Archives. They're being helpful. They're trying to bring in agency people to release information under our release dates. But there is a flaw right now in that there's no one really overseeing this process. If there's a new group of information that's found, then maybe there'll be an impetus for something to change there. But I think that if anyone's concerned about records that are not going from agencies to the archives right now, that's a subject to take up with policymakers, because there should be some type of oversight board, if certainly not as extensive as a review board, but a board that can oversee this process and make sure that new documents are continuing to be sent to the National Archives.
Dr. Wecht, I'm wondering if you would be interested in commenting on the question of what do we do? We've learned so much, we have so many details. Many of us are struck that something wrong has happened here. What can we do? Is there any way we can address that? Do you have any ideas?
It's difficult, Dan. I think that a program like this should be repeated, as have many excellent programs in the past, because the educational process, not to just talk in meaningless, platitudinous terms, but education is ultimately the basic feature of a society like ours, and the ultimate avenue of pursuit. The young people here, someone asked me, one of the reporters asked me about young people and something similar to what you just said, and I said, it's interesting, we've had in the course of these days and tomorrow hundreds of students, high school and college, mostly colleges, and some graduate students. Even if 10% of those carry this message and help to develop programs in their respective schools now and in the future, some of them will become teachers and so on. Just think, how that will move geometrically. What else, can we do? We've all been involved, most of us, at one time or another, with one or several kinds of movements. The Democratic Party, the Republican Party, for abortion, against abortion, against drugs, marijuana reform, you name it. You can focus, for better or worse, on something, and you get a movement and so on. It's impossible to do that here, and I commented on this the other evening. I don't want to repeat everything, but for openers, and just fascinating to comment upon for those who weren't here, and I bet you a lot of the critic researchers haven't even thought about this so much, that in our group we got people from the extreme right and the extreme left. And there are people from the extreme right and the extreme left who have made a profession out of attacking us, the critics. Now, if anybody can explain to me, for example, why left-wing liberal Democrats who revered Kennedy hate us, the critic researchers, I'll give you a big fat kiss, I'll take you to dinner, whatever. I can't, I mean the mentality. The point I'm making is that it's hard to get a handle on something and fight a battle. Eventually, you can prevail in America if you keep pushing for something. Going through the program, I was sitting here, just one fast comment on this. We have 8 medical doctors, 6 attorneys, 7 PhDs, 2 MD JDs, 1 MD PhD, 1 MD JD PhD, sitting here, Jack Snyder, a federal judge, a United States senator. Where the hell is the New York Times and the Washington Post and ABC and CBS and NBC? Where are they? You got thousands of people here. You had 1,300 people here on the campus of a respected, Catholic-oriented major university and so on. The point I'm making is, I wish I wish like anything that I could give you an answer, but here's a game plan and so on. No, I don't have it. We just got to keep doing our thing. Judge Tunheim talks about this window, and that is marvelous, and keep doing it, and keep writing, and keep knocking on the door. I'll just say what I've said before. I'm not optimistic. Maybe it's because I was younger, but I genuinely believed 30, 20 years ago that the door would be opened in my lifetime. It's not going to happen in my lifetime. There's still too many people. You know, you got these fuzzy-cheeked 22-year-old kids that graduated Harvard and Yale, and the FBI and the CIA sucked them up, and and they still have the guy 2 generations ahead of him. He was their patron saint. He was their rabbi. You know what I mean? And whether they ever met him or not, they think they did, or they saw portraits of him. And to expect these people now, even though they have not a damn thing to do with the assassination, that that they're going to get in there. No, they're not going to trod upon the memories of their revered leaders. It's going to take another generation or 2 until there's total depersonalization, until that umbilical cord is so attenuated that nobody even can remember anything, not even the names. And then maybe, if we can dig up Jim Starrs, he'll come back and he'll dig up Kennedy and Connolly, and we'll get started on the whole thing over again.
We'll move on. I've talked to a number of people here this afternoon. And among some people, there's a feeling that it's hopeless to make a change or a reform or address this issue. And I instinctively, as an American, reject the concept of hopelessness, because if it is in fact hopeless for Americans to make a change in their government and to affect their government, then our nation is essentially lost. And I reject that as an American. Maybe it's naive optimism or hope, but I just instinctively in the gut reject the idea that we're in a hopeless situation that we cannot affect. I would like to turn now to the forensic science issue, because the purpose of forensic science is to obtain that goal of justice in the courtroom and to seek truth. And I'd like to turn to Dr. Henry Lee and see if he has any thoughts on how his profession can bring us closer to a sense of justice in this case.
Thank you very much. Cyril, I dear him like a brother to me, but I totally disagree with him with hopeless. I always see we should set a limit of no limit. Far away from no way. There are still some stuff we can look at. Where are we going to go from here forensically? Okay. Of course, any investigation, especially a homicide investigation, we need information. The information basically from 4 sources: crime scene, physical evidence, witnesses, and data mining. Look around today, so many people spend their lifetime doing data mining, re-interview the witnesses, try to re-examine the physical evidence. So my comment going to just limit on physical evidence. If we can find some information through restudy those physical evidence, which yesterday I talked about, of course, elemental composition analysis, they use neutron activation. Of course, many of you read the article today. This shows there are some problems with the original analysis. With newer technique, of course, tomorrow you're going to hear Hunt, Wren, and Wexler, the rest of us talk about this issue. They are newer technique now. ICP specifically, can we use a newer technique? Look at those all evidence. Further DNA, possibility of DNA analysis. Yes, we learned, we're exhausted, no, nothing left to sort of thing. But those bullet fragment casing, don't forget that 3 missing three casing, in the book deposit may have some trace DNA evidence remain. The bone material found in clothing. Of course, the jacket from few blocks away from the scene, which under a vehicle, we should at least look at whose DNA is. Is that Lee Oswald or somebody else? That can give us some information. The book deposit, those cartoons, if still available. With today's a lot of newer technology about DNA, we already moved far away from the first generation of RFLP and the second generation PCR, DQ alpha polymarker, now STR, and of course Y chromosome STR with mitochondrial DNA and single nucleotide. Just so many newer procedure now, maybe worth a while to do another trial. Any biological evidence still remain. If we can find something, the DNA shows a mixture of JFK and Governor Connolly, that would prove one thing. If we show just one person's, it also proves something. Now, whose fingerprint? There's a new book published. Of course, this questionable fingerprint is that Mac Wallace. Definitely, you can take a second look if we found the lip still available. That should provide us some answer. The book deposit, their fingerprint, Oswald's fingerprint found on those boxes. The rest of fingerprint apparently say were contributed by 2 law enforcement officers, 1 Dallas PD cops, the other FBI agent. But today, we are really move ahead to have 250 different new chemicals can develop latent fingerprint, not just use iodine fuming or anhydride. So can we just examine those boxes again? Maybe some additional fingerprint can develop. Of course, yesterday I talked to Jim about his research. Tomorrow he's going to talk about on the safety plate on the weapon. There are in fact fingerprint on there. Whose fingerprint? Is that like FBI claim unidentifiable, or Jim Lee Oswald or somebody else? With image enhancement, so much we can do. This is a fingerprint which a homicide case happened almost 30 years ago. It's say impossible. But after remove the substrata, you can clearly see that's a loop and delta area have enough rich characteristic. We're putting our efforts and got the hit. The case was solved. So we should never take something called impossible. And blood spatter evidence, of course, we did not look at it, but there may be possible information, the direction of the trajectory. We should expect to see some biological evidence in either way. Is those clothing still available for us? And can DNA provide us some answer or not? Of course, reconstruction, a complete reconstruction or partial reconstruction, so many things being done. The problem with full reconstruction, of course, a lot of, original autopsy, we hear a lot of term today and yesterday, and a lot of issue involved. So maybe it's not possible to tell us the whole story. But with brutal film, with other available information, maybe we can do a partial reconstruction. Because the time allocation, I'm not going to talk any more about partial reconstruction. What the future study with the forensic evidence, the 2 bullet fragments found in the car, still available. This ICP can give us answer. Any biological material still available, which DNA will provide some answer. The bullet trajectory issue, can we, with some newer equipment or newer technology, can do another partial reconstruction. And of course, as I mentioned, the blood spatter pattern and the trace pattern found in the clothing, or can we do something else, and the latent fingerprint. 40 years later, we're still arguing about single bullet theory or two bullet. And as the only minority in the panel, I have no answer for you. And of course, my good friend, Dr. Bottom said one, and Dr. Wecht said two. I still have an open mind and question mark. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Our next presenter will be Dr. Michael Welner, who is an expert in forensic psychiatry and a member of the advisory board of the Wecht Institute.
This is a weekend full of curiosity, and a lot of curiosity that remains. And I find myself asking, as the conference Saturday closes, just by a show of hands, how many people in this room have spent their own money in trying to resolve questions of who was responsible for assassinating President Kennedy? Show of hands. Okay, quite a few people. How many people have actually gone to the end of interviewing people that they felt could give information to help resolve who assassinated President Kennedy? Raise your hands. Okay, still quite a number of people. How many people have actually gone to the end of traveling to a place where they felt they could find answers as to whom was responsible for killing President Kennedy? Raise your hands. Okay, yes, the conference doesn't count, but only for this. All right. How many people know members of the Kennedy family directly? Raise your hands. All right. How many people know personally principals of this case? Raise your hand.
What do you mean, principle?
Ruby, Oswald, some of the people that we heard today, Shaw, some of the key figures, Garrison. Raise your hands.
I know Cyril Wecht.
Okay. How many people know someone who was responsible in some way for President Kennedy's assassination? Raise your hand. You got to ask. And that is the essence of forensic psychiatry. Forensic psychiatry is not what you think when it comes to unsolved crimes. It's not about profiling, but it's all about interviewing. It's about interviewing, it's about interrogation, and it's about communicating and eliciting from witnesses, sometimes from suspects, and sometimes from people who may be connected to the two, not knowing necessarily where the trail will lead, but gathering in the physical evidence that other forensic scientists give us and working with it. It is essentially a specialty that is macro-organic forensic science that operates with the raw substrate of human intelligence. And so forensic psychiatry is at the heart of the useful information contained in the secrets of Adolf Eichmann in documenting and chronicling the extent of Nazi horrors, or the information that is elicited from Khalid Abdul Muhammad in drawing out the parameters of Al-Qaeda and perhaps eliminating and thwarting future major terrorist attacks. And more recently, we saw forensic psychiatry contributing in unsolved cases belonging to the Green River Killer in the Pacific Northwest, which vexed authorities and some of the greatest law enforcement minds in the United States. Interviewing was also at the heart of resolving injustices, such as the Central Park jogger case. And so interviewing and human intelligence are very important parts of forensic psychiatry. Law provides the boundaries. Psychiatry provides the skill. But at the end of the day, it is still the hunt. And it is the hunt that is the central core of forensic psychiatry. The hunt is facilitated by careful preparation, patience, visit, perhaps a second visit, perhaps a third, and rapport. And then information comes out through which one might be surprised, might be stunned, but might never have believed accessible in the past. There is no one, for example, more difficult to interview than a sex offender, and a sex offender who has bodies on his hands that no one else knows about, because there were no witnesses. There was no Zapruder film. There was no great interest. In fact, the victim may have been a faceless person who has been discarded by family and friends long ago. And yet, that information comes out somehow. How does this happen? And so the interviewing can ultimately bring that rush of providing information. And here we have a case of an enormous array of witnesses who have been interviewed, asked some very important questions, and may yet have very important answers to give as they're still alive. Obstacles, conspiracy, cover-up, we've heard a lot of it. I can tell you from my own experience that in any case to which a government agency is connected, you can expect that there are people who don't want their activities to be exposed. Does that mean that they are necessarily involved in the crime itself? Not necessarily. Would organized crime necessarily want to expose the extent of their activities, even if they have something to say about an unrelated but very important matter? Not necessarily. So there's always someone who's covering something up. The more complicated a case gets, the more likely you are engaging a government entity or an organized crime entity or a corporate entity. It's something to be expected as part of a forensic examination, and it's an obstacle. You don't investigate in a desert with a horizon that you can see for miles. No. You investigate in a swamp with gators and swamps and trees and low visibility, and you simply check one avenue, check another avenue, and try to prevail to get to the other side. I don't think that this case is any different. In fact, I feel much more of a sense of optimism about this case when I take a step back and compare it to other cases. This is a case where witnesses remain, and there are many cases that ultimately get solved to which there are no witnesses. This is a case where interest preserves memory. People remember what they were doing on X day, and X day a week later. And most of the crimes that come to the attention of forensic psychiatrists and forensic investigators, memories have faded, and the crimes are irrelevant, too irrelevant to motivate a person to access their memory. Conscience evolves over time. The mere fact that we could hear earlier from Bob Tannenbaum about Secretary of Defense McNamara, his conscience was not what it was some years ago when you compare it to the conscience that brought him to say, I lied. And then there is far less pressure on people to protect, notwithstanding my agreement with Cyril's point about how people do feel perhaps an instinctive zeal to close ranks. There are people who are products of a skeptical society, not just as a matter of the assassination, but of Watergate and a skeptical press. There are critical voices who are in positions where they can cooperate, and I'm sure that the judge, in your experience, you found people who were willing to be open, notwithstanding their concerns about policy and procedure. So I believe that an investigation can and should be done. I come to this meeting far more pristine than you do. President Kennedy was shot before I was born. And so my frame of reference is of a person who is used to confronting obstacles, sensitive cases, and some of the same elements that, as I take a step back from the very informative and very thought-provoking presentations that I've heard, I ask myself that were I to be dropped in the middle of this situation, what would be the answers? I think that for future investigations that some in this audience will be involved in conducting, you will be successful if you have certain elements as a requisite. One, access. You must have access where you're in a position where people actually will talk to you. You can get to them. That's why Watergate happened. Yes, they were reporters, but yes, they had access. You must have authority. The judge had authority. Some of you, if you can engage someone, you wish to get them to talk to you, perhaps you can interview them, perhaps you can elicit information, but one of the first questions that they ask is, who are you? If you're the Washington Post, if you're the New York Times, you are somebody. And that's why the authoritative media and perhaps the endorsed home media of specific cities is able to be successful. So you must have authority. You must have autonomy. If you don't have autonomy, it is inevitable that the political agendas and the pressures and having to get a job when your job finishes and having to be mindful of favors and what happens if you're investigating and someone that you have a connection to turns up as being a person of interest, have to have that kind of autonomy in addition to the authority and the access. But ultimately, this case is also aided by a tremendous number of records, including the records that we've heard have just been released. There are witnesses who have been interviewed, but they could be interviewed again, not necessarily because their memories will change, but because there are questions that if you look closely at the specific content of those interviews, you will find a question that hasn't been asked. I'm often asked, what's the most important question in a forensic interview? And my answer is always the question I forgot to ask, because there is always something that in retrospect and on reflection and on additional information can aid in the inquiry of forensic science human. Finally, an ounce of fact is worth a pound of expertise. And that is why the best antidote to rumors and innuendo and fantasy, which has to accompany a sensational case like this, is taking the time to study the documents, serious inquiry, and get face-to-face access to witnesses so that you can hear it yourself. I do believe that a case like this can be solved. My optimistic note that I would like to end on is that there are precedent of extremely painful investigations that have gone on in other parts of the world. Perhaps South Africa is an interesting example, where there was not so much a focus on how we have been wronged, how we have been disappointed. That's self-evident. But this is a forensic science conference, and forensic science is about curiosity. And it is a quest. And if it is a national quest, then it is easier to engage people in a collaborative search for answers. I do hope that this conference inspires you to carry the torch and to be part of that quest.
Those who know me, many of you happily do not, know that it is my want to take a different tack. And I think exhumation is a different tack. But I also think it's important to talk in terms of the real life, the real world, and not abstractly. Indeed, not entirely objectively. I knew where I was. I knew what I was doing. I knew what I was saying when John F. Kennedy's assassination was announced. And I was thunderstruck. I'm an Irish Catholic. He was the icon for Irish Catholics. I'm a card-carrying, passport-carrying Irish citizen. I was personally aggrieved. I was permanently scarred by the death. What did I do? I immediately joined the President's Commission on Civil Rights Under Law, established by John F. Kennedy. I went to Mississippi and Alabama in 1964 and 1965 for the purposes of fulfilling his promise to assist people in need. But that was not enough. I knew that he had also established what was run today, the John F. Kennedy 50-mile run in Maryland. And I thought possibly I could purge my psyche by doing a physical effort of that nature, which my daughter did today. And I did the 50-miler 5 years in a row. And every time I went to Mass in the morning and I prayed for John F. Kennedy and his family. And yes, I'm still broken 40 years later. And I wish my cane would allow me to join my daughter, but it doesn't. And I have visited Arlington National Cemetery on the site of his burial place on so many occasions that it's countless, especially late in the afternoon when the sun is setting, and on occasions when the snow is on the ground, because he was, at that time, my life. He spoke for not only Irish Catholics, but for so many of us young people back from the war who were looking for a better world, and he spoke for that better world. Therefore, I don't come before you today objectively, not at all. In fact, people have often asked me over the years of the 25 and more exhumations that I've conducted, is there anyone you wouldn't exhume? And I've always said my father and John F. Kennedy. I loved both of them. He was my surrogate father when my father died. And I certainly feel very strongly that if there is going to be an exhumation, count me out. I couldn't possibly be there. Not with surgical gloves, not gowned, not masked. I just couldn't handle it for lack of scientific objectivity. I've come before you today to discuss, however, what might be accomplished by such an exhumation and how it might occur. But first, a short travelogue, Arlington National Cemetery. There are ample signs pointing the way to the gravesite of John F. Kennedy. And when one arrives there, it is generally very crowded, unlike so many others. And a close-up indicates the name of John F. Kennedy. Not much more. Not the kind of thing that William Butler Yeats has on his grave in Ireland. Horsemen pass by. Nothing of classic poetic sense. And then I felt the flower, the living ingredient marking his gravesite, is something that is very important. And Robert F. Kennedy, immediately adjacent, a simple and plain cross with a ground level marker and nothing more. And how many people were there? None. They walk by, they stand, and they meditate at John F. Kennedy's, rightfully so. And then the unknown soldier. And it's noted that the unknown soldier is one way and John F. Kennedy is the other. As if you have a choice. But you shouldn't make the choice for one or the other. When you're there, do both. And when you're at the unknown soldier's monument and you're watching the parade before you, do stay and think of John F. Kennedy and his wartime service. And then, unfortunately, there are other people buried in Arlington National Cemetery, not at all of the stripe of John F. Kennedy or any of the other heroes that are there. James Alfonso Fry, for those of you who are lawyers, yes, the man after whom the Fry rule of admissibility of scientific evidence was named. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery, just down the way from the gravesite of Medgar Evers in Section 36. Another hero died just a few months before, shot down in his prime of life in Jackson, Mississippi. And McClellan's Gate, which you have to walk through if you take that direction to get to the grave of James Alfonso Fry and of Medgar Evers. And emblazoned across the top of McClellan's Gate, you have Theodore O'Hara's famous poem, part of it, Bivouac of the Dead. And I could take the time today to read it, but it is important to recognize that that gate and that poem was written by a Confederate soldier, and it stands as a monument in Arlington National Cemetery, meaning unity and joining together. Another cemetery exists in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and that is the cemetery to Huey Long, Senator Huey Long, also and assassinated by someone, and a mystery still develops with respect to that, in his prime of life in 1935. And then there are others who have said, don't touch my remains. That is, if we can authenticate the fact that it is Shakespeare who decided to leave this on his grave in England. And whether or not he did or not, I can't say. But there are those who have decided in advance. It's kind of a living no exhumation designation by an individual. So much with respect to that background. Now, you all have my Judging the Dead, which was distributed today, as to the various criteria that one should have, at least I have, with respect to conducting the exhumations that I find desirable. I have conducted, I've lost count at 25 exhumations. I've orchestrated them with people like Michael Barden, Henry Lee, and others assisting me, sometimes from a distance, sometimes personally there. I have learned a great deal from them and from the exhumations themselves. I have exhumed, going back to Samuel Washington, the brother of George Washington, dead more than 200 years at the time of our excavation, our archaeological dig for his remains in Charlestown, West Virginia. You know, of course, of my work on Jesse James and the Boston Strangler. I hear that Dr. Humes, in his JAMA article, says that there is nothing to be learned from an exhumation of John F. Kennedy's remains. And that's a quote, nothing to be learned. Dr. Humes apparently has not been, as he was not at the time he did the autopsy, a specialist in wound ballistics. He apparently is not a specialist in exhumations either. In every exhumation, there is what I call the terra incognita, that unknown ingredient. Now, it doesn't draw you in and trap you, but it says to you, you can never be sure that what you will find will have advantage or disadvantage. That is not a justification for going forward, simply because there's a mystery in every exhumation, but it is a reason for saying nay to someone who says there is nothing to be learned. Ralph Erdman, a student of mine, went down to Texas as a medical examiner, and he was defrocked. Why? Because he conducted autopsies which he didn't conduct. And how do we know? Because he buried his wrongs. He buried the fact that he didn't do the autopsy, but he was paid for doing the autopsy. And the exhumation resulted in disclosing to the world and his being rousted out. Samuel Swan in Scranton, Pennsylvania, died in a Lackawanna County prison, allegedly as a result of strangling himself. Did the exhumation a year or so ago. I asked the medical examiner, the pathologist who did the work, will the neck organs be there? Oh, yes, they'll be there. For sure they'll be there. Well, we wanted to look at them. There was no reference at all in the autopsy report to those neck organs, nor that they had been taken for later observation. We did the exhumation. They're missing. They're still missing. We're still trying to find them. Nothing to be learned? Well, as far as I'm concerned, there's a great deal to learn from that. Dr. Weiss was the alleged assassin of the only medical doctor in this country ever alleged to be an assassin. Dr. Weiss, I exhumed as the alleged assassin of Huey Long. And people said, why don't you exhume Huey Long? One, because Russell Long said no. Two, because you saw the statue standing on top of his grave. I mean, even in my best days, I couldn't move that statue. And my wife wouldn't allow me to use family funds to pay for its being moved. But I exhumed Dr. Weiss. Exhumed the alleged assassin? What is it going to tell you? It told us, quite conclusively, that he had defense wounds. He was defending himself against Huey Long's Cossacks who were shooting at him. The stereotypical defense wounds that you would find, never mentioned by the Cossacks, the officers surrounding Huey Long. Mary Sullivan in the Boston Strangler case, the last victim. Who would ever expect that so many years after her death that we would find, at least microscopically and through DNA, the seminal fluid mixed in her pubic hairs? It's totally unheard of, never ever done it. And we extracted the DNA, and it was not that of Albert DeSalvo. Is that something to be learned? Well, it certainly made the family, both DeSalvo and Mary Sullivan, and by the way, another example of lack of objectivity, my mother was a Sullivan, and her father was Al Smith's right-hand man, who was the first attempt to get an Irish Catholic into the White House. Frank Olson, the CIA experiment that went foul, the press said to me, what do you expect to find when you exhume him up in Frederick, Maryland? I said, I don't know, but if you're asking me, I'll say I would speculate that maybe we'll find a hematoma. They coshed on the head. You know, Peter Sellers would call it a bimp. A bump on the head. And guess what? That's exactly what we found. And totally inexplicable, except for the fact that somebody struck him in the room before he left the room, as it is said, as a suicide. There are prerequisites to conducting a legitimate, in my view, autopsy. And indeed, in today's phrasing, there are two towers. Two towers. Or, if you like, there are twin towers. If the Lord of the Rings doesn't grab you, maybe 9/11 will. One of those is there's got to be a legitimate historical controversy. Well, you don't know whether there's a legitimate historical controversy until you do all the background research, documentary and otherwise. So, for example, did you know that Lee Harvey Oswald was exhumed? He was exhumed. Why? Because it was thought that maybe the person who died was not Lee Harvey Oswald. So he was exhumed. Why? Because he might have escaped. With John Wilkes Booth, it was desired to exhume him for the same reason. Did he escape Garrett Farm? The escapists are all over. The Dauphin in France, did he escape? No. Indeed, there are two books written, full-length books written on the fact that Jesus Christ was not crucified, he escaped. The escapist theories are almost equivalent to the Kabbalistic theories of many fraught with conspiracy conclusions. Not theories, but conclusions. And finally, family consents are necessary. And family consents, in this case, we will never get. The John Connolly death resulted in a family refusal to exhume his remains or even to review them before he was buried. And certainly you're dealing with Arlington National Cemetery. They admitted the exhumation of Medgar Evers and Lieutenant Michael Blassie, Vietnam veteran, but they're certainly not going to allow it here. And therefore, a court would be called to play, and a court would never allow it over the objection of the family. So that I don't see any possibility at all, regardless of any possible merit, of exhuming John F. Kennedy. Thank you.
We're going to now ask for any panel comments that we might have, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So if you have questions, if you want to line up at the microphones. And I'm just wondering if Dr. Lee or Dr. Wecht have any comment or...
Yeah, while they're going to the microphone, I want everybody to join me in wishing Dr. Henry Lee and Bob Groden a happy birthday, both.
Thank you, thank you.
No, Bob, no, go ahead.
Do you all have any comment on any of the presentations or ready for questions? Okay, Rex, go ahead.
It's Rex Bradford. I have an observation that I would ask for a comment by anyone on the panel who's interested. It seems to me that with the possible exception of the Mac Wallace fingerprint business, that forensic science contribution would be on the conspiracy, no conspiracy question. And while I'm certainly a fan of the application of forensic science to this case, I think Don Thomas's acoustic presentation yesterday was proof enough of that. To my thinking, and I think it's probably shared by many people in this room, that's at least one or two levels removed from the real issues here. If you believe that the evidence already conclusively shows conspiracy, then the next question is just simply who killed John Kennedy? And it's unclear to me that forensic science is going to provide much in the way of answers in that direction, and even the documentary releases of the review board, which can provide a lot of information and tantalizing leads, are at this far remove of 40 years going to be fundamentally inconclusive, I think. And so I guess to me what's becoming the more important question at this more and more distant reserve in history is the fact that we have a situation where the documentary evidence that we have, which is voluminous, makes it crystal clear, as Gary Cornwell pointed out, that the Warren Commission did not at all even begin in a search for the actual truth. And I would point out that the same can be said in spades for the HSCA now that their files have been released. And this story about the incredible disgrace of the investigations of this investigation is, I think, the real story 40 years later, and it's something to which the public at large is largely ignorant.
Okay.
And I'm wondering
Any
if there are
panelists,
comments
would you
on-
like comment on your statement?
I'm sorry it was so long-winded. I guess I'd observations on whether or not, what is the right question for people in this room to be actually even asking at this point? Is it whether there was conspiracy? Is it who killed Kennedy? Or is it larger questions about how things which are fundamentally obvious to many people in this room are actually still secrets in an open society and off the table for discussion?
Dan, I want to make one quick comment that I've been making for a long time. Everybody has their own reasons why they are here and why they have been pursuing this, some for almost 40 years. Tink Thompson, Mark Lane, and others of us shortly thereafter, and others quite recently. But whatever the reasons are, we all want to see something done. But you see, a comment was made, I don't know, by somebody yesterday, you can't trust the government and they can't do it. Oh, I agree. But don't you see, you're not going to do a thing unless the government gives you permission. The government opens the door. How is the door to be opened? There's only one way. Jim said, forget the Kennedy family exhumation. You know, exhumation, that's in another world. They won't even talk to anybody or do anything. So you don't have that going for you, like you did with Medgar Evers and a lot of other cases where the families are pounding on the door and so on. There's only one way to open up the door, and that is to make it clear or to reach a point of evidentiary proof that there was a second shooter. Now, Joe, you, me, Tom, Mary, Harry, Corsica, and the Mafia, doesn't make any difference. A second shooter. Why? Because then, under the Federal Criminal Code and the Texas Criminal Code, that means conspiracy. That means that somebody out there, he may have died, we don't know, nobody knows, right? But now, since there's no statute of limitations on homicide, the case has to be reopened. And where it takes you, you will see. But, with all due respect, and then, those who know me, I've been heavily involved in politics, perhaps more than anybody else in this whole place. So, and I love to talk politics, and I love to engage in the philosophy and the debate of politics, but that's not going to get you anywhere by itself. Oh, do it. I'm not suggesting you don't do it. But if you don't keep pounding this forensic scientific stuff to get that door open, you're never going to accomplish anything. Because the first thing you got to do is for somebody in the federal government officially to say, case is open, somebody is out there, 1 or 2 or 25 people, and it's a murder investigation. And of course, you see, that's exactly what they won't allow to happen. And now you think that everybody's comfortable and happy with the single bullet theory. I don't care what Senator Specter says. I don't care what my close dear friend Michael Biden said. I'm not going to embarrass Michael now or tonight in my home, or Senator Specter, whom I have a decent relationship. What do you really, really believe? Fine. They have a right to say it. Do I really think they are totally comfortable with this? Heck no. But they know, too, that the moment that that single bullet theory is abandoned, that's the moment that the case is open. And that's why there's no give on this. Don't you see? So keep in mind, using the techniques that Jack Snyder has laid out, using the inquisitorial powers of the forensic science psychiatrist that Michael Welner has talked about, and the detailed forensic scientific guideposts laid out for Henry Lee, and keep pursuing these things. That's our only hope. You're not going to get it because you're going to convince somebody. I don't care if a communist becomes president, if a totalitarian person takes over the country, not going to make any difference. The Kennedy case is not going to be reopened by a left-wing dictator, by a right-wing dictator, by a liberal president, by an ultra-conservative president. It's not going to happen. It's going to have to be forced through the doors of the legal community, and the only way that's going to occur is if you throw out the single bullet theory, and therefore there was a second shooter. There's no other way. Oh, the audio, of course, and all this other stuff too. I shouldn't limit it to single bullet theory. The forensic scientific aspects, and that's why this conference was put together, to emphasize from a forensic scientific standpoint what can be learned and yet what can be accomplished regarding the JFK assassination.
Dr. Lee,
Well, I just want to comment, besides Wallace fingerprint, just learned from Judge, Oswald's clothing still available maybe in Texas. That never have any report regards the examination of his clothing. Any gunpowder residue, any trace evidence in the pocket. What the rest of them, we don't know. There's still possibility to look at some of the evidence.
another question over here.
Yes, hi, my name is Ray Carroll. In terms of a new investigation, originally the state of Texas, which was the authority that should have investigated this crime in the first instance, since it was a murder that occurred in Texas, the then Attorney General Wagner Carr suspended his investigation. He was going to hold a public inquiry, unlike the Warren Commission inquiry. He had planned to hold a public inquiry in Austin, Texas, which he suspended at the request of Errol Warren and President Johnson. When the Warren report was published, he also published a very short report called the Texas report. It's about 15 very short pages. And in that report, he indicated that he was happy with the Warren report, but if questions ever arose about the Warren report, then the Texas inquiry would be reconvened. Well, I think it's fair to say there have been some questions about the Warren Commission, and Since the Constitution, it seems, provides that Texas is really the proper forum in the first place, isn't that the place to begin a new inquiry?
And let me add to that also that I think the sentiment that J. Edgar Hoover expressed after the assassination, that the case would remain open at the FBI for all time and that all leads would be run out, was the correct sentiment. I don't think that that's what happened. But, you know, in terms of what the stated position of the FBI at that time was that they were not going to close the case because of the magnitude of the case. But would one of the panelists like to take on the issue of the Texas?
Fat chance, Texas. Fat chance. Don't let the Durst case decision fool you. It's still Texas. You got a better chance, I think. I mean, knock on all the doors, but I think you got a better chance at getting a door opened a little bit at the federal level than you ever have in the state of Texas.
And I'd like to comment on that.
But try.
Right. I believe that the failure here is in the executive branch of the U.S. government. The Congress has tried, and we've heard of their attempt at investigation, but it's really the failure in the executive branch, meaning the Justice Department. I was very interested to hear that the Justice Department was not aggressive in seeking subpoenas of records on behalf of the review board. And I believe that the problem in getting this case to a place of justice lies in the executive branch of the U.S. government. That's
But Dan, that's my point, though. If a guy like Jimmy Carter won't do it, and if a guy like Bill Clinton won't do it, you see what I mean? I don't want to be a pessimist or a cynic. I'm just trying to be a realist, though. I mean, you're right, the executive branch.
No,
you know.
Right. I'm not going to be a Pollyanna optimist, but I've put to a presidential campaign that will go unnamed at this point, but that if you look at the activity they're engaged in running for president currently, and if you read Kennedy's American University speech in June of 1963, no Pax Americana. He said, what we seek is not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. And yet today, as we had U.S. News and World Report told us, we have Pax Americana enforced on the world by the new national security policy, which is the world dominance strategy. Kennedy initiated nuclear arms control in that speech, and there's a continuity of nuclear arms control from the American University speech until President Bush pulled out of the ABM Treaty in 2001. And so you see policy changes and the policy direction that is so much in discussion today in the country. You need to look back and read the American University speech and see that Kennedy had put us on a path of peace and a path not of world domination. And I do think in that way that the issue of Kennedy is very relevant to today and could not be more relevant to today in terms of the policy direction of the country. That's my thought. And I have so far received a positive reaction from a presidential campaign, but no statement yet that I know of. Comments? Question on this side?
Paul Swickard, Riverside, California. This one's directed at Judge Tunheim. There is an assassination document that won't be released till 2017 or until the death of an American intelligence agent, and another one under the same circumstances for 2010. Can you tell us the circumstances of those two documents?
Well, I don't recall the circumstances off the top of my head. I certainly can look that up and find that for you. I think the reason for a decision not to release a record until 2010 or 2017 had to do largely with, if it's a 2017 document, it's probably an intelligence operation that is disclosed that we were convinced is still in operation and can't be disclosed. If it's 2010, that is probably largely a predictor, and it's an agent's name involved. That's a predictor of a time when that person is likely to be deceased. So that we made a determination after hearing from that person that disclosure of their name as an intelligence agent or as an intelligence operative or as an informant or whatever that person is, that their life could be in danger if that were disclosed. We were very skeptical of those claims, and we didn't grant very many of them. Most of them we said no. We think you can live with the fact of the world knowing that you gave information to the FBI or something like that. But on some, we were convinced because of the nature of the work that they had done during their career. And that would be the rationale, I'm guessing.
Thank you.
Over here.
My name is Dan Sutton. My question also for Judge Tunheim. What's the status of the release of Oswald's tax returns?
It's a good question. Oswald's tax returns, by law, cannot be released. Actually, the Congress considered that point. The IRS requested the Congress to allow the review board to release tax records of individuals who were associated with the assassination story. The Congress said no. Congress made an express exemption from the review board statute so that we had no ability to release tax records. We did request that the IRS present substitute documents that would essentially convey the information without releasing the tax records, and that was done. The other way to release the tax records is to get permission from Oswald's widow. And at least when we were in operation, we tried to get her to cooperate with that. She declined and would not sign such a waiver to allow us to ask the IRS to release it at her request.
Hal?
My name is Hal Verb. I'm an independent researcher. I have testified before the review board about almost 10 years ago. My question is this. It's a single question. Because of the nature of the medical evidence, the significance not only for the solution of the crime, but also for the collection of assassination records, I have been told on good source that when the medical testimony was given before the board, that not a single member of the appointed board attended any of the sessions. I'd like to know, first of all, if that's true, and number two, if it is true, why didn't they appear?
The answer to your question is yes, it is true. We did not travel to Dallas with the staff members who conducted the depositions of the Parkland doctors, nor do we travel to the locations where the depositions of the pathologists were taken. In part because this was really not the type of activity that was clearly authorized that the board hold hearings and collect evidence in the statute. As I mentioned earlier, I thought we were a little bit out on the limb on doing this to try to clarify the record, but I agreed that we could do it, and I felt rather than doing it in front of the board at a hearing of some kind, public or private, it would be best to have lawyers and experts on the staff conduct depositions without the additional circus of board members being there. We then reviewed the transcripts, of course, and we also contributed to ideas for the staff members to use in their questioning.
Thank you.
Question on this side.
This is a general question. Given that we know that the fear of death is a real threat, what is it today in 2003, not 1963? What is it that's holding back the media outlets, given our capitalist society and the money that could be made by the Rupert Murdochs, New York Times, Washington Post? What methods of fear does the government employ to keep these outlets down? I mean, the next Robert Woodward's out there somewhere.
In the interest of accuracy, I would point out that the Fox News channel did the only show I'm aware of this week that reopened the case, and it was entitled Case Not Closed. It was a show by Greta Van Susteren. And so, that, as odd as that appears in political terms, that's what happened this past week.
I'm reminded of a very controversial case that we had in New York of the Central Park jogger who was brutally raped, and 5 suspects taken into custody, apparently gave confessions, videotaped, convicted, and sentenced to prison terms. And the case was really forgotten, except by their families, who contended that these assailants were innocent. Well, some years later, and of course neglected by the press as well, even though a number of people had advocates, civil rights people, felt that these suspects had been railroaded. Certainly a less controversial case, but in New York, quite a loaded one. Well, someone came forward because he had a pang of conscience. There was something that resonated with him, and he decided to talk. And he spoke of having been directly involved, and ultimately forensic science followed from that to directly implicate him. The reason I'm telling you this is not only to address what Dr. Wecht said before, that you have to make it so plainly obvious that there's more than one shooter, perhaps by an admission or some direct attribution, in order to make it completely impossible to ignore. And if not, it is that kind of man bites dog that will inspire the major press. Otherwise, they're going to see it as another clue, but typically it's not going to have that seismic effect of having the press see it as new news to create a groundswell, which then inspires a reopening of the case, in my opinion. In the Central Park case, it was successful, and ultimately it had an enormous impact. Not only that, but the prosecutors from New York admitted that they had made a mistake, exposing the city to enormous liability in so doing.
Martin informs me the History Channel also deserves positive mention, that they were running documentaries this week that the case was open. And I have my own brief answer to your question. If you live in the Washington area and you know what's going on, you know that the security agencies of the government have very close relations with the media, and they make it a priority to have those connections with the media. We've seen historically documents released about the CIA's media relations program, which basically their strategy was to get an in with the editors of all the major news organizations in the country. So I think you find that if you're espousing a point of view that is opposed by the federal security agencies, they are likely to have their point of view reflected in the coverage and not your point of view. That's what we found.
Dan, Michael said, talking the Jogger case, the families, Michael, the families. Jim Starr said, exhumation, forget about it, okay? We have a very prominent member of our advisory board and so on. He loved to come to Pittsburgh, declined because he is a personal friend of one of the Kennedys. Maybe he was being a little too sensitive. The point I'm making is that with not only zero, but I think, and maybe somebody knows more than I, and I don't know anything personally, I'm assuming, I'm conjecturing, with negative, let alone zero, negative reaction from the Kennedys and so on, and from the Secret Service agencies, and from the news media establishment, you got a tough road to hoe.
Right, but when it breaks, it may break big. You never know. Jim?
Yeah. Cyril, I find it somewhat ironic that you're so pessimistic because, frankly, I think you've done it. You've turned a corner with this conference.
God, Jim, I hope you're right. Never in my life have I wanted to be wrong more than on this. God, I hope I am totally wrong.
Yeah. And admittedly, I'm a person who sees a glass half full when it's 2/3 empty. But my sense is I've always held out a very slender hope that the case would be reopened. Now I think that it is possible, maybe even likely, that it will be reopened even if we don't do anything. But there is still a great deal that we can do that has not been done. You have to approach it. You have to lobby people. You have to lobby the media. You have to prep them with the kind of substantial scholarship and expertise that has been demonstrated throughout this conference. Then I think we can do it. The more difficult problem, and what needs to be given very serious thought to, is that because of the history, the past history of one dismal failure after another, we have to create an institution capable of handling the assassination without political pressure, without time limits, with adequate subpoena power, with adequate funding. All of those problems have to be thoroughly thought out and addressed. Thank you.
And thank you, Jim. We're going to have to close, I'm sorry, because of time, but I did want to say, in closing for my part, that I feel that the wrong that has occurred, that we've heard this weekend about all the evidence, the wrong is so profound that I think we must try to right the wrong. That's my feeling for the good of our country. So thank you very much, and please give our panelists a hand.